Yeah, I can't hear him either.
Can't hear you.
You muted yourself, Michael.
Michael, I think you turned your
I
microphone.
muted myself. How about that?
Yes, you did, and I'm not
myself.
muted, so mute me.
I need to figure out how to mute everybody. Well, you guys just go mute yourselves, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
How do I do that, guys?
Here. Oh, I can see. Let me see. I think I can.
Bottom left, bottom left.
I got you. I got
Bottom
you.
left. And you might have to click on your screen or touch your phone
I
because
got it. I got it. I got it.
I
from
did
Carol
that.
Sue. I got it. She's good. All right. You guys are all good. All right. So sorry about that to you people that are watching the recording. When Tolkien set about to write The Lord of the Rings, he had his mythology in place, some of it manuscript form, none of it published except for The Hobbit, and a few poems. And he starts off with that big birthday party. But for him, that was a false start. And then the second chapter is The Shadow of the Past. The Ring is leaving the Shire with Sam and Bilbo and Merry and Pippin. They encounter the Black Riders and they make their way to Bree. And then they enter the inn at Bree. Most of you know this, right? You've either seen the movies or you've read the books. So they get to Bree and they're in there, and Tolkien writes that there is this swarthy looking fellow. And they don't know who he is. He will eventually introduce himself as Strider. As Tolkien is writing this, he has no idea who Strider is. He doesn't know that Strider is Aragorn yet. He says this in a letter written in the early 60s. A woman was asking him, I guess, about his process. And he said, you know, when I wrote this, it unfolded before me as I wrote it. In other words, he didn't have it plotted out. It unfolded. And I think it's one of the great things that makes The Lord of the Rings what it is. You'll notice in the lectures that I put up for these 3 months, we're starting off with trust. And 3 months down the road, we're ending up at a Bree of our own where I'm talking about Marcion. How do you do systematic theology? How do you do systematic theology starting with trust and moving down to Marcion? I said to myself, Michael, you're going through the same process Tolkien did. So somebody said to me, well, where's this going to go? How many lessons is it going to be? I said, I don't know. I don't know. I am really very excited about this opportunity because what I've been doing for the last several years, and some of you I've had conversations with about this, is that I've been integrating everything. I've been through a lot of personal suffering this last 4 years. I mean, I wanted to make a bumper sticker one time, and my former wife would not let me do it. But I said, it's the best Christian eschatology I could think of. And so please don't be offended. Most of you know that, you know, my mind doesn't work right. I said, I got the perfect bumper sticker for Christians. Life sucks, and then you come. Pardon me, but to me, that's like perfect, right? But I don't know where this is going. But what I do know is that through all the suffering that I've endured here for 4 years, and particularly learning to really integrate everything I've learned over the years from my theology, biblical studies, church historical studies, psychology, sociology, my medic theory, and most recently, the last 4 years, economics, geopolitical theory, everything, you know, linguistics, hermeneutics, everything, shamanism, it's all come together. And so you're the first group of people that's going to get this holistic approach to how I'm seeing things. So I'm looking forward to your feedback. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, starting points are everything. I mean, where you begin is very important. So I want to take you on about a 15-minute journey of starting points. I want you to see how different theological traditions take different starting points. Because I'm going to have to tell you why I'm taking the starting point I'm taking today with trust. Now, every single one of these, with the exception of the fundamentalists' approach that I'm going to show you, they are all appropriate starting points, every last one of them, okay? But they're all going to be a little different. Some of them are going to have similar themes. But when we're going to take a gander through the 20th century at some systematic theologies that I have. I mean, I've got a pile of books here to get through, peeps, and I just could not put any more here on my table. It would take too long. So where I want to start is in the mid-70s with the Lutherans. Okay, the Lutherans here have Christian dogmatics. So when the Lutherans are going to do dogmatics, where do they start? Well, the first place they start is prolegomena. Everybody starts with a definition of terms at this point. You're going to see this a lot in theology, a definition of terms. Even I'm going to have to do that. So they got prolegomena, and they talk about dogmatics, the history of dogmatics, etc. The second locus, the Trinity. Well, that's good Lutheran thinking, because after all, what does the Book of Concord start with? The Trinity. And then you get down to the third locus is on the knowledge of God, reality and revelation. Then the fourth, God the Creator. Then sin and evil. There's that Augustinian rendering still with us. Sin and evil, the person of Christ, the work of Christ, the Holy Spirit, the church, the means of grace, which is the sacraments, Christian life. Finally, you get to Christian life. And this is very similar in Calvin too. This is about where you get to it. And then finally, eschatology. That's the Lutherans. You're familiar with that kind of structure of theology. If you've been to seminary, or if you've even casually read theology, you'll recognize something like that. Now here is J.C. Wenger. He was a fundamentalist Mennonite, and I don't have any fundamentalist systematic theologies. I have Louis Sperry Chafer's, but it's not a physical copy. But he again begins with prolegomena, and then God is creator, God is revealer, and that's where you're going to get Holy Scripture. God is redeemer, God is sanctifier, very important to the Mennonites, and then eschatology. But it's a fundamentalist approach, and Holy Scripture is dealt with in the chapter at the very beginning on Revelation. Now, another Mennonite, a more liberal Mennonite, is Gordon Kaufman, who was teaching at Yale back in the day when Kathy and I were in seminary. And Kaufman does the same thing. Chapter 1, revelation and theological knowledge. Now, I don't know how many of you have this on your shelf, Gordon Kaufman's Systematic Theology. That first chapter is a worthy read, very worthy read. He talks about the theological enterprise, the revelatory history and the concept of God, the Trinity, right up front, then God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the Christian understanding of the world, creation, providence, and eschatology, and then finally salvation. Then we get, now as we do a more critical approach to systematic theology, we're going to look at Paul Tillich. Yeah, Paul Tillich, the reasonably well-known philosophical theologian of the mid 20th century, really. He starts with the nature of theology, the organization of theology, the method and structure of theology. He's got 70 pages of that. And then he gets to reason and revelation. Well, there you have it. This is going to be the bugaboo in so many of these approaches to theology. It's also going to be something we're going to have to deal with. And so you're going to notice this theme runs rampant through 20th century systematic theology. And then the reality of revelation, chapter 2, being and God. I mean, Tillich is writing in a post-Heideggerian world, and so he has to deal with ontology and metaphysics and what he hopes is the end of them, although he didn't live long enough to see Derrida come on the scene. Then you have the wonderful series by Douglas John Hall. So there are 3 volumes. So this is the first volume, Thinking the Faith. Then comes Professing the Faith, and then comes Confessing the Faith. And this whole first volume, where's he going to start? Well, he's going to start by talking about the disciple community. Oh, this thrilled my heart when I read that, because now I've got an approach to systematic theology that places it within the context of the church and discipleship. And he talks about discerning our context. And then he talks about the discipline of theology. But the whole first 237 pages has to do with the place of theology, that it belongs in the church, not in the academy, in the church. You can do religious studies in the academy. You can study Christianity as a religion in the academy, but theology is done in the sphere of the church where the Lord is worshiped. And that brings me to the next one. One of my favorite systematics, Jeffrey Wainwright. He wrote this fantastic book called doxology. So where does Wainwright begin? Wainwright is a Methodist who has an extraordinary knowledge of the liturgical tradition of both the Eastern and Western churches. And so he begins with what he calls substantial matters, the image of God, creator and creature, the earthly task, social being, God and humanity's distinct, firstborn son and last Adam. He moves on to Christ and then spirit and then church. And then part two, the means by which we get to this, scripture, creeds and hymns, the rule of prayer, and the rule of faith. And then his contextual questions deal with ecumenism, culture, ethics. So this is, again, it's another starting point. You'll see how each one of these writers is going to be bringing to bear within their understanding of what systematic theology is, that most important starting place. It's important to them. In the 70s, the German theologian Helmut Thielicke, his evangelical faith, and Thielicke, by the way, not American evangelical, European evangelical, his evangelical faith, the whole friggin' first volume has to do with Cartesian and non-Cartesian ways of doing theology. And this whole thing is a great big exercise in intellectual history from the 17th through the early 20th centuries. And finally, part two is called Theology in Self-Grounded Secularity. Did that say anything to any of you? Any of you like really resonating with that right now? No, I didn't think so. And he has to deal with Kant and Hegel and Schleiermacher, and so that's the Europeans. You come back to America, you got Tom Finger's contemporary Anabaptist theology, and it's actually one of the worst ones I have. I know Tom personally. I just think this volume is not good at all, because he deals first with this whole Anabaptist history, how Anabaptists understand things, arguments within the Anabaptist community. Then he gets church, sacraments, missional dimension, evangelism, and then the convictional framework, Jesus and divine reality, which includes atonement, the person of Christ and the Trinity, human nature, and eschatology. So you see where the Trinity is, way at the end. You with me so far? Now, out of Fuller Seminary was James McClendon. He has 3 volumes: Ethics, Doctrine, Vision. And so you'll notice that all your modern systematics all have that missional ending. Okay, they're doing this whole missional thing out of Fuller. But where does McClendon begin systematic theology? With ethics. How do you derive theology from ethics? Isn't it usually the other way around? But McClendon puts our head on straight. And if you'll remember, if you've read the Jesus-Driven Life, I have a quote in there, I forget who it's from, that observes that only an academic professor in an ivory tower would think you could derive ethics from eschatology. Our eschatology derives from our ethics. This, by the way, is one of the failures of the church. They're trying to move people away from the doctrine of hell towards some form of universalism today. You see that all over with our Facebook friends, right? And that's what they're trying to do. But you'll notice there's no ethics that change as a result of that. There's no conversation in that direction. And so McClendon would do that to us. And he again starts off with a prolegomena. Then he talks about the church, and one of the first white male systematic theologies, this chapter is entitled Black Religion as Embodied Ethics, and the focus of body ethics. And he moves into this heavy Anabaptist frame with a whole discussion of Bonhoeffer and the politics of forgiveness, Dorothy Day, and then finally ending with pacifism. And then his doctrine is going to reflect that, and the missional view he has is going to reflect that even more. Then there's the Roman Catholic, Urs von Balthasar's Theodrama. And where does von Balthasar start as a Catholic? Well, he's going to begin with trends in modern theology, event theology, historical theology, orthopraxy, dialogical theology, political theology, futurism, functional theology, and talks about the church and the theater and the need to have theology come back as not as proposition, but rather as drama. We tell the drama of Jesus. We tell the drama of God. It's a story. It's an epic tale. And that's theology, not these propositions that we sit and cluster together in confessions. And that's where he begins. But for me, the most important starting point has been that of Karl Barth. This is his Church Dogmatics. Because what Barth was able to do was not only open the door to some of these modern structures that you're looking at, including the theodrama of von Balthasar, who wrote a book on Barth back in the 50s. But Barth begins by talking about theology as a science. That's where he begins. And then he asks, what is this science that we discern? I'm sorry, what is the object that we discern with this science? Well, we discern the self-revealing God with this, and we do it critically and rationally. And we come up with the doctrine of the Trinity. But this is very important. For Barth, the doctrine of the Trinity is not something to be believed in, but to be believed through. The doctrine of the Trinity is our hermeneutic. I don't know if you've ever given pause or thought to that, but it's very important. And then some of you are familiar with the name Wolfhart Pannenberg. And so Pannenberg begins his late 20th century systematic theology pretty much the same way that Kaufman and others did, by talking about truth. What is truth? What's the relationship between revelation and God and truth? How do we talk about the reality of God? And then the Trinity. So following Barth in a certain way, that's what you have. So where I'd like to begin is with a thought process that was generated back in the Jesus-driven life, made its way all the way through knowing God, and I didn't even see this until I started thinking about it. That's what 4 years of pressure does. It forces you to think. It occurred to me as I was working through a lot of these things that there is one common feature to everything that we do as humans. And that's this thing we call trust. Now, I'm just going to glance at my notes right here. I don't have a printer, so I can't print anything. When I teach Greek, Shane, you'll recognize this, Metzger, lexical aids. When a student is learning Greek, they have to learn vocabulary. And so I have them take this book and they memorize. And we start with words that occur more than 500 times in the New Testament. And there's not that many. There's maybe 40 or 50 words that occur more than 500 times in the New Testament. Now, once you eliminate the conjunctions like but and once you eliminate the prepositions like in, at, on, above, those kinds of things, through, on account of, once you eliminate all of these kinds of things, you're left with verbs and nouns. And I just want to have you listen to the list, it's very short, of verbs and nouns that occur more than 500 times in the New Testament. Because doesn't it seem to you that we want to pay attention to that which is said the most? You with me so far? The number one word repeated more than 500 times in the New Testament is the word rapture. You're supposed to laugh. I can see some of you laughing. No, listen, ready? Human being. I become or am. I am. I said. Sounds like a Neil Diamond song. I come or go. I have or hold. I say or another verb for I say or speak, and I do or make. And then the interrogative pronoun tis, te, who, what, which, why, more than 500 times. God, human being talking and doing. What does that suggest to you? Now, the word faith is not in that list, or trust. And I'm going to talk to you about how I translate that and why in a moment. But that word's not in that list. But it is in the list of words that occur from 200 to 500 times. Here are verbs and nouns from that list. So these are the secondary dominant themes: holy, brother, man, woman, I answer, the earth, I give, I am able, I saw, the number one, as in there is one God, day, I will, wish, or desire. Another verb for I speak, I take or receive. Disciple, name, heaven, father, pater. Pisteuo, I have faith in, or I believe, or I trust. The noun pistis, faith or trust. Pneuma, spirit. Polus, pole, polu, much or many. Huios, son. What's interesting is the fact that in the New Testament, the verb pisteuo, I believe, I have faith in, I trust, occurs in all the literature up to Colossians. The verb I believe does not occur in Colossians. Okay? The noun does just a few times, but it doesn't occur in 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Revelation either. The verb I believe occurs 86 times in the Gospel of John, but not once does the noun faith or trust appear. So the New Testament writers are focused on this activity that we call faith or trust. Now, you can, if you, again, you can, if for those of you that have access to a lexicon, a Greek lexicon, I mean, these are columns, man, columns of uses. And there are 6 columns of the usage of pistis, of pisteuo and pistis in the New Testament. For most of us, when we come to our translations and we read Paul's citation of Habakkuk in Romans 1:16 and 17, where Paul says, those rectified by pistis shall live, or if you want to take it more as an adjective, less as an adjective and more as an adverb, you can say, those rectified shall live by pistis. Should we translate that as faith, belief, or trust, and is there a difference? And I'm going to suggest to you there's an enormous difference. And next week, we're going to parse out these differences. But for tonight, I want to simply turn you to the book that's been most influential for me, and that is Teresa Morgan's Roman Faith and Christian Faith. And what she does in this massive, incredible book is a linguistic study of the Greek term pistis and the Latin term fides. Okay? And she is able to show that the Greek term pistis, or the verb pisteuo, is an action, whereas fides is an intellectual operation. And this is hugely important because for if you've read my stuff or seen my videos, you know that I am constantly showing how the current contemporary American Christian scene is fundamentally Gnostic, because it is using a Latin understanding of pistis. Somebody says, they say, what do you believe in? And you start listing the things, that you believe in, don't you? You with me on this? Okay. Or they'll say, do you have faith in God? And normally that's said or spoken through this enlightenment lens of, do you really trust an invisible being? You with me? So we are dealing here with so much Western thinking that comes about because we have lost the Greek understanding of pistis as used in the New Testament. Pistis is best rendered by the English term trust. Now, you can say to me, well, gosh, Michael, that's just not a big deal. But the fact is, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you that trust is the one thing that we have in common and that also forms the backbone of our capacity to be a communal species and differentiates us from the animal kingdom. Watch this. How many of you know of the social contract? Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract, right? Every time you get in a car and you drive down the road, you're engaged in a social contract. The law says you stay in your lane. The law says you don't drink when you drive. The law, and you trust the people on the other side of the road are going to stay in their lane, right? And that they ain't been drinking or something. That's what you trust. In the same way, as Jean Piaget and others have demonstrated, what's the first and most important emotional building block in the human being that a child between birth and 3 years old has to learn? Trust. And that's why parenting for the first 3 years of life is the most important thing in developing healthy human beings. And it is something that we are miserable at as a species. When the child does not learn to trust the parent in a healthy manner, they will learn to trust the parent in an unhealthy manner. What do I mean by that? A child has a parent that says they love them. And once the child's 2 years old, and they can, hear mommy and daddy, I love you. But the same parent that uses the hands to comfort them uses those same hands to smack them on the face. The child doesn't know about the hand. Can the hand be trusted or not? In the same way, that child grows up. Now that child stands on the edge of a cliff. And that child knows, maybe now that child's a woman or a man, they know that if they jump off that cliff, the same laws of gravity that are keeping them attached to the top of the cliff will draw them all the way down to the bottom. Unfortunately, that's normally at some crazy 32 feet a second or something, and of which the ending is not good. In other words, the person knows that the laws of physics apply to them too. Fear is the result of unhealthy trust. Let me say that again. Fear is the result of unhealthy trust. We fear jumping off that cliff because we know we trust the laws of physics apply to us. But the child will grow not knowing whether to trust the hand, not knowing what you and I would refer to as agape, unconditional love. We have literally raised generation upon generation upon generation of persons who were not given the simple nurturing and care that was necessary the first 3 years of life to create the emotional structure of trust. Some people were very fortunate or very blessed to have truly loving parents that help create that emotional stability, that ability to trust. Now, it's more than that. We can talk about social contracts and child development. We also have to talk about money, because on money in the United States of America, at any rate, is the word trust. The IOU debt that is a Federal Reserve note that we call a US dollar is backed by the good faith and credit, credere, to believe, to have faith in, to trust in Latin, of the US government. Money works because people believe money works. People trust that the money is in fact worth what the government says it's worth. And when people no longer trust the government or the government's money, then you end up in periods of hyperinflation. And you have to have a currency reset. And we're in one of those now. We haven't been in one in 50 years, but about every 50 years, one comes along. 40 to 50 years. This is also true in my experience in shamanism. In the training I've done with Grandfather, if you've read my book, Walking with Grandfather, the hardest thing for me in the shamanic training, I mean, I rebelled against this. In every class I went to, probably for the first 8 or 9 classes, and you can read about it in Walking with Grandfather. The hardest thing for me was to trust that when Tom said, this is the exercise, go out and do it, that I could do it, that I could actually do it. But once I learned how to trust inner vision, what the natives call inner vision, we might call it intuition. We might also call the Holy Spirit, the inner teacher. Once I learned to trust that, yeah, then things started happening that just were out of my ordinary. And I've talked about some of those in Walking with Grandfather. But everything that we do as human beings is about trust. And so is it odd that the Apostle Paul comes along and says, the gospel is accessed by this very same mechanism, trust. Trusting the message, trusting that when the messenger says, the Father is kind, you are forgiven, that is truly accepted. Theology begins with trust. Now, what I've just done is an extreme, almost hyperbolic explosion of the concept of the individual. And the reason I've done that is the same reason Kierkegaard had to do it in 19th century, mid-19th century Copenhagen in Denmark. The Hegelian system in Kierkegaard's day had become so all-encompassing, so totalizing, that it was all about the community, the crowd, the mob. And Kierkegaard had to single out that it was the individual who followed Jesus. In the same way, our current contemporary situation is exactly, well, we never learned from Kierkegaard, we didn't learn this, from Barth, we didn't learn it, from Bonhoeffer, we didn't learn it, and we're exactly in the same place today, where all theology that's being done is coming out of the same starting point. All theology, it doesn't matter to me whether it's conservative, liberal, Catholic, Protestant, Anabaptist, Orthodox, you name it, anything in between. Theology begins with the mob or the system. And it always will justify the system. It is not about trust. Theology doesn't teach us to trust the Father. Theology doesn't teach us how to suffer. Theology doesn't give us the grace to forgive. Theology could do these things. And in times past, certain theologies were able to contribute to that. But today, theology is done primarily in the framework of fides. And so fides is an intellectual operation and fundamentally Gnostic. We are not saved by knowledge. That's number one. So whether you're here as a PhD, like Stephen, or you have an MDiv like Kathy, or you're working on one like some of you might be, or whether you're just a regular person, theology is not about how much knowledge you have. It has nothing to do with that. It doesn't have to do with you know more than, or what Gnostics call secret knowledge. If knowledge saves, I'm the most saved person in this damn room. You know, But it doesn't. We are not Gnostics. We are saved not by knowledge or knowing the right thing. Listen to me very carefully. Theology does not begin with doctrine. It doesn't begin with knowing the right thing. It has to do with how we get there. Theology begins with the act of trust. Trust that the gospel message about the loving Father, the counseling and comforting Spirit, and the true human, the Son of God, sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us, that this can be trusted. And the only way that you can have this trust is something that I tried to demonstrate in my last book, Knowing God. Because what I did there, and how many of you have read that book? Just give me a little hand up if you got, I got 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 of you, okay? What I tried to do in that book was show that part of the problem with starting with a fides approach to theology, an intellectual approach, a knowledge approach, is that one will begin with the incarnation. And when you begin with the incarnation, you ask that great Anselmian question, Cur Deus Homo, why did God become human? How did God become human? How can it be possible for Jesus to be 100% God and 100% human? Because that's 200%. You with me in all of this? Did he have the same will as the Father, or were there two separate wills? Was Jesus divine will and human will one and the same, or were they separate? All these debates that end up in the early church. Theology does not begin there. It may have conversations around that down the road. I don't think they're important anymore. They might have been important for the 2nd through the 5th or 6th centuries, but I don't think they're that important anymore. But theology begins with the act of trust. We are not Gnostics. And that's the most important lesson I can give you. Each week, I want to recommend a book to you. And if I have the PDF file, I will put it in the group in the files section, and you can download it. And I'm going to try and get you a book a week. But this week, I'm going to get you Philip Lee's book, Against the Protestant Gnostics. I know a few of you have read that book. It's hugely important, because what Lee is able to demonstrate in that book is that at the origin of America, with both the Puritans and the Congregationalists, that is the conservatives and the liberals, two theological movements developed in tandem in American church history. And they've been at war since the beginning. You think the conservative liberal war today going on in the church is like sort of new? No, it's been going on for 250 years or more. It is our religious war. It's our internal religious war. That's why we have two grand meta-narratives that both claim to be Christian out there right now, pounding us over the head. One with litmus tests, one with political correctness tests. Both requiring you to say certain things or not say other things. Both that have the same exact presuppositions as the ancient Gnostics. And what Lee argues is that conservatives and liberals in the United States are arguing over who has the true right to these Christian Gnostic presuppositions. I don't know if you can begin to see the great irony in all these preachers and theologians out there saying, we have the truth, we have the truth, we have the Gnostic truth. It's like, who gives a shit? You know, Gnostic truth doesn't save. Trust saves. The act of believing that God is with you, even though everyone else around you says God is not with you, could not possibly be with you, because the crap you're undergoing is not something God would give to his children. Trust begins at the cross. Trust begins with the crucified Jesus. That's the move I made in knowing God. I didn't start with incarnation. I started with cross. I end with incarnation, but I start with the cross. I don't believe that Jesus lived, that Jesus died, that he was, I mean, I do believe that propositionally, but my trust is an activity that is a personal activity in relation to another person, someone that communicates. Remember the use of the verbs to say and to speak in that list that we looked at? I trust. I learned to listen deep with them. Yes, it is a process. I'm going to tell you right now, it is a process, and it only comes about through crucifixion. Now, I'm not hoping you guys go through hell and back. I'm really not. But as Martin Luther once said, it is suffering that makes a theologian, and a theologian who doesn't suffer is no theologian at all. That's Luther. Okay? So if you have been through suffering, if you've been rejected, if you've had periods in your life where, again, you're hanging on a cross and everybody's looking at you saying, God isn't going to do anything for him. And you might have felt that same way. It's precisely there in those moments where you trust and are able to say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, that you have the first true starting point of Christian theology. And there can be no other. It's the ability to endure the fragmentation, the destruction of social trust. That's why the scapegoat mechanism is so important. Everyone around looks to, Andrew, please don't comment, it's distracting. Everyone looks around and at Jesus, and anybody else in their right mind would look at that mob and say, they're right. I really screwed up. I'm not loved by God. How could God let this happen to me? I mean, of all the righteous people that have ever lived, don't you think Jesus had a right to ask that question on the cross? Right? If Jesus was a modern person, that would be the question the modern person asked, but Jesus doesn't ask that question. It never enters his mind. He only calls what we use the term God. He only calls God Abba from the cross. And the citation of Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, is a citation. It's not a prayer. The other two times he uses the term Father, Abba. And the last one is, into your hands I commit my spirit. I trust you. This is not how I want it to end, but I trust you. That's where the gospel begins, in the dark. And that's what makes Easter Sunday so powerful. That's why the concept of light is associated in the early church all over the place with Easter. Are you with me on this? Does this make sense to you? Got to go back, look at my notes, make sure I've got it. Okay. All right. My goal, and God hopes, I'm 60, going to be 64 in a couple of weeks. And I hope to live a decade because I want to take my friends, that's you, on a theological journey of doing Christian theology, not just for today, but really for the decades to come. And that's why I'm very happy to have a lot of young faces in here. The church is going to need theologians in the future. The academy won't be able to produce them. Seminaries won't be able to produce them. The church won't be able to produce them. So like Bonhoeffer, I'm starting my own little Finkenwalde, if you know what that means. This is my little seminary and you are my guinea pigs. But I want to show you how to do theology in such a way that when you are engaging in the act of theology, and you all will be doing it, you'll all be learning, you will be able to have something that will be important for the coming generations. One of the issues that I don't think is faced at all today is the awareness that we have entered into an apocalypse. We are in an apocalyptic time. We're in the middle of a currency reset. We're going to have a hot war within 3 or 4 years. There's going to be another hot war, folks. Just hang on. I mean, there's a lot of crap coming down the pike. A lot of stuff coming down the pike this next decade, because we're at the end of a whole bunch of historical cycles all happening at once. And they usually are pretty spread out when you do this kind of research on cycles of history or cycles of economic history or cycles of political history. Normally they're kind of spread out. They don't all hit at the same time, but we're in a decade where we've got a 50-year business cycle, an 80-year demographic cycle, a 300-year debt cycle back to England, and now it's an 800-year debt cycle back to the Renaissance. All coming due. All coming due. This decade. And that doesn't count other cycles. So this is going to be and because we're a global village now, we're all interconnected in the globalization project, started with Clinton and is now coming to an end. It's coming to an end. The world is going to change in ways faster than you can imagine. A decade from now, the world will not look or be the same as it is today at all. And it's in that time we are going to need to have persons of faith, trust, who are able to communicate the goodness and the beauty of the gospel in spite of the intense amount of human suffering that's about to come. We have a responsibility to proclaim Christ crucified, the suffering God. That's our mission. And that also means we have to learn to live it, which means we have to learn to suffer too. The New Testament does not valorize suffering. It doesn't make suffering into something that it isn't. It's hell. But what it does do is give us a frame to eschatologize it and recognize that all things work together for good for those who love God, for those called according to his purpose, as Paul says. And that will end that. I'm going to turn the recording off.